Hello and welcome to our first video blog here. Today I'm going to be talking about hydrogen sulfide in deep pitted cattle barns. This is an issue that's crept up on us here pretty active this fall. We've had a couple incidences in eastern Iowa, western Illinois, southwestern Wisconsin where we've had some cattle losses due to some hydrogen sulfide issues during manure agitation and removal. This is an issue that we haven't seen much of in deep pitted cattle barns before. Certainly we're not quite sure why. We're trying to investigate the process a little bit further, but we do know a few things about how to manage the situation, and I wanted to share with you some safety tips, especially as related to monitors, as well as agitation and ventilation practices that might be helpful for you. So we're going to talk about a few things today. One, we'll talk through what is the issue, what we know about it. Two, we'll talk through monitors and which ones might be useful as you think about selecting one. I strongly recommend considering them. They're a very useful tool and a cheap insurance policy to help keep us and our workers safe. And then we'll go through just some agitation and ventilation tips. So when we think about the gases that are released during manure decomposition, especially liquid manure decomposition, there's really four gases that I tend to focus on. Those are hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, and carbon dioxide. All those gases can be toxic to us at certain concentration levels. Some of them, hydrogen sulfide, can be toxic at relatively low levels. Some of the other ones, like carbon dioxide, we have to hit pretty high levels before it causes a toxicity issue. And actually, carbon dioxide tends to cause issues from oxygen displacement more than toxicity. But certainly all those issues that in certain circumstances might be the one that's most of a concern to us. When it comes to manure agitation and removal, hydrogen sulfide tends to be the one that we should focus on the most. So hydrogen sulfide at high concentration can cause death in seconds to both animals and people. So it's really, really worrisome from that regard. And it's something that we have to give good focus to make sure that we keep ourselves and our animals safe. So hydrogen sulfide is a colorless gas. It smells like rotten eggs at low concentrations, but at higher concentrations, and after we've been exposed to it for a while, we lose our ability to smell it. So our nose is not a good instrument for us to rely on for safety. It really comes to we need some sort of electronic instrument to provide us with the feedback we need to know whether or not those conditions are safe or not. When it comes to manure, hydrogen sulfide is released very quickly when we agitate. Anything that causes disturbance to that manure surface can cause some hydrogen sulfide bubbles and bursts to leave the manure. So agitation is the perfect recipe for it to come off. One other fact about hydrogen sulfide is it's denser than air, so it tends to settle and sit on that manure surface. So if we get some wind currents, some uplift, that tends to be when that hydrogen sulfide will leave the manure pit and get up to either the animal or the worker breathing zone, and that's when it's really a concern to us. So we'll talk through a little bit about why that might happen and what we need to do, what we need to think about when we're ventilating those barns to give us the best opportunity for success. So hydrogen sulfide does have some impacts on human health. At low concentrations, less than 2 parts per million, that's when we can really start to smell it. It has a very low odor threshold. It's easy for us to smell. But as I told you, at higher concentrations, we lose that very quickly. When I look at this chart, when I see that something like 20-25 parts per million, that's where we really start to see some symptoms that start to make me pretty worrisome, especially dizziness there. When we're moving manure agitation equipment, moving manure tankers around, that's some pretty heavy equipment, some pretty large tractors that we're driving, and if we get dizzy while we're driving down the road from some exposure that we had at the barn, that's a dangerous situation. So we really do have to be aware of what we're being exposed to and how to react. As we go on higher, 100 parts per million there, that's something where we think of a concentration that really has immediate impact on human health. And it's a very worrisome situation where we have to take a corrective action immediately. There's been some circumstances where I've seen concentrations reach 500 to 1400 parts per million when we're agitating manure. So those higher concentrations can result. And that's where we start to see some of that death loss from animals being poisoned by hydrogen sulfide, or in worst case scenarios where human health is impacted from that. So certainly this is a gas where we have to be aware of the risk and know what we can do to mitigate some of those effects. The first big thing I'd recommend that anyone working with manure do is invest in a monitor. These monitors don't have to be that expensive. We can get some of them for $100 to $200. If we start looking at monitors that will measure multiple gases, we might have to pay up to $800, but in some situations they might be useful. When I think about how to classify these monitors, I tend to think there's two different things. There's ones that are just alarms. They won't give you a continuous readout of the hydrogen sulfide concentration you're experiencing. And then there's ones that are alarms and displays. So those alarms and displays, they're giving you a continuous readout all the time of what we're being exposed to. Most manufacturers make both types. When it comes to using one for manure application and monitoring for human health safety, I tend to like the ones that work as a display just a little bit better. They give us a lot of feedback so we can know sort of how our actions are impacting the hydrogen sulfide concentrations we're seeing. Especially if you're the operator around the pump or on that facility, that might be useful data for you. You can walk around, sort of check and see what's coming out of different fans or different parts around the building, or just know that when we take one step one direction and one step the other way, sort of see how those levels are changing. And one thing we've seen when we're out there doing some monitoring of this is from one point to another point that might only be 1 foot, 2 feet away, concentrations can change extremely drastically. So that's nice to get that feedback to know where's sort of the best place to stand. How should I be adjusting my agitator to minimize my risk? Certainly if we're just in that application tractor, maybe something where it's just an alarm, where if we experience that 25 part per million, it gives us an audio and a visual signal where it flashes and beeps or vibrates, so that we know that we have to move what we're doing, change what we're doing, but not that continuous feedback of actually seeing the level might be not quite as necessary. Certainly from the data I've seen, the data we've collected, right around that pit, right around the pump out tractor tends to be one of the more significant spots for human exposure. I'm going to give you some agitation tips, some ventilation tips, but I do want to point out that during agitation, deadly gas concentrations are possible. So even if you follow all these best practices, there's still a chance that we might have a sudden burst of hydrogen sulfide come out where it's potentially hazardous or poisonous to either us or the animals. So take that seriously. When it comes to agitation removal, I strongly recommend staying out of the pen or building. You should never be going into a barn where the manure pit is being ventilated. Hydrogen sulfide is sort of a boom or bust gas. It comes out very quickly and all at once, and then we might see a lull, but before you know it, it might fire up again for what seems to be no reason, and we get another burst coming off. And that makes it really dangerous and unpredictable. So there's no, if you've agitated for this long, it might be safe to go in. It's a stay out of the barn. When it comes to our cattle barns, I recommend removing the animals as possible. I recognize that some of you have divided pits within your building where that might be more feasible, as we only have to remove a smaller portion or one pen of animals, whereas some barns have connected pits and removing all those animals would be extremely difficult. But if you can remove the animals, I most certainly recommend doing that. That might be moving them to a different part of the barn, or it might be moving them into a holding area for a little while we handle that pit and before we move on to the next one. In these buildings, wind is our ventilation system, right? They're all naturally ventilated. Maybe we have a curtain that we're going to drop to let the wind through a little bit more easily, but we're reliant on the weather for that ventilation. To get the air exchanges an hour we really want a 5 mile an hour per wind directly through the barn. And that's a sustained 5 mile an hour wind. We need that as a minimum ventilation really to be where we want to be. We tend to recommend 10 miles an hour, especially if that wind isn't directly through the barn. Another comment on wind. For worker safety, if you can, try and set up on the upwind side of the barn. That way the worker is getting the freshest air directed at him and the hydrogen sulfide is blowing away. So we sort of get a cleaning air effect. If we set up on the downwind side of the barn and we're directing our agitation nozzle back towards that barn, there might be some hydrogen sulfide coming out within the barn, and then it's all blowing at us, the worker, and that's not really what we want. We want clean air by us. And then there are some best agitation practices to follow. As I mentioned, hydrogen sulfide is denser than air, and that's sort of where that first recommendation of getting at least 1 to 2 feet below the slats, between that manure surface and the bottom of the slats, really comes in. We know when we start agitating, when we start pumping out of that manure, we're going to get some hydrogen sulfide coming off, and that gas has to go somewhere. Well, if our pit is really full, that hydrogen sulfide is going to be in the animal breathing zone. It just has nowhere else to be. If we start to get some depth there between the bottom of the slats and that manure surface, well, we might be able to accumulate some of that hydrogen sulfide in that headspace area before it causes concentrations that are really of major concern to the animal. The second one is no rooster tailing or surface agitation. Certainly, I understand in some of these cattle barns we get some pretty thick, hard crusts, and that might be very difficult to deal with if we don't do surface agitation. But we know that surface agitation causes hydrogen sulfide to come off the manure much, much more quickly. So we're going to get that burst effect, and it also tends to cause some drafts or some currents in that barn that are a little bit unpredictable. So it gives us a better opportunity to lift some of that hydrogen sulfide really into the animal or human breathing zone. So we really don't recommend it if at all possible. So certainly if you're going to add surface agitate to try and break up a crust, really do try and get those animals out of the facility. The other one, next one would be don't direct nozzles towards walls or pillars or corners. Well, if you're hitting a pillar with your agitation stream, there's a lot of churning going on, and that churning causes a lot of hydrogen sulfide to come off, so that can be really dangerous. When it comes to directing it towards walls and corners, I'm really concerned about dead areas of airflow in the barn. So if we're in a corner, that might be a natural place where we get less air, or if we have a sidewall that's solid, we might not be getting that airflow through there. So they're just potentially low airflow areas where even if we're getting just some hydrogen sulfide to come out, it's more dangerous for those animals for us. The other thing I'd say is try and avoid sudden changes in agitator depth or intensity. Trying to make those changes a little bit more gradual. Anytime we start swirling new manure that hasn't been previously agitated, there's a better chance for hydrogen sulfide burst, because oftentimes the hydrogen sulfide or the manure is oversaturated with hydrogen sulfide. It's just waiting to come off. So when we stir those new sows, when we stir that new manure, we're probably going to see a burst. And if we move a lot of new manure all at once, we'd have a lot bigger burst. So smaller changes, more gradual changes are definitely preferable. When it comes to these barns, we're reliant on wind. So I recommended at least 5 miles an hour of wind speed directly through that barn, or more preferably 10 miles an hour, sort of so that we can handle some gusts and some lower wind moments. If we aren't getting that sort of wind speed, definitely consider PTO driven fans, and those should be directed either at the animals or at the worker near the pump. We really want to get clean air to the animals. I have heard some people mention that maybe we should try and do things like question whether we should be trying to do things like trying to draw air from that manure storage. And the truth is, unless we modify our barns, put something on the coverage, we probably can't draw enough air off the headspace to really pull all the hydrogen sulfide out. So really what we're trying to do is provide fresh air for any animals in the barn or for us as workers. A second one that I want to point out for you is putting some covers around the pump out. And basically those covers or curtains sort of act to direct our airflow a little bit and keep the worst of it from impacting the person managing the pump. And we'll take a look here at that on the next slide. So this is a video that I have of some smoke testing we were doing. So what you see is that smoke is rolling into that pump out. So right now we have that pump running, that agitator is swirling the manure in there, and it's created an air current where it's basically sucking that air right back into the barn. Now this might be good from worker safety, as it means the hydrogen sulfide is going away from us, but it also is sort of a fresh air effect where all of a sudden that air is going into the pit, displacing some of that hydrogen sulfide that was down there and causing it lift up into the animal breathing zone if the animal's in the barn. On the other hand, if we turn that pump around and start using it as a loadout, so we're pulling that manure to us, I've seen some cases where we get an air current basically following that manure as it's drawn towards the pump, and this might start working as an outlet again, and air is drawn towards us. So that's certainly something that could be a concern for the person operating the pump. One thing that people have tried to do, and I think has been relatively successful with some of the monitoring we've done, is try to put what I'd call a pump-out curtain around there. So here on the left, you can sort of see a picture of what that would look like. It's just a plastic sheet wrapped around a rod that will extend with the weight on the bottom to pull it down to that manure surface. So we're trying to make that weight so it'll float on the manure surface and not pull directly to the bottom, but we're trying to cover that air gap between the manure and the top of the pit. So on the right hand side, you can sort of see one that's installed where we had pump outs on the outside of the building. That makes it a little bit easier to install this sort of thing, but certainly you can envision how it might work in a situation where we're lifting a slat and dropping it in it as well. We might need a curved curtain, and it might not work quite as airtight, but it's still a step in that right direction. And really what that does, if you think about it, is it makes it much harder for air to flow into the barn or back out at us, and it sort of stops that swell of hydrogen sulfide coming up right near that worker in many cases. So that was a real quick tour of some of the information that we have. Certainly hydrogen sulfide is a critical issue for us to think about, so do take it seriously. Up there in the left-hand portion of the screen, you can see some of my contact information. If you have any questions about this, do give me a call, send me an email, and I will do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. The website's on the bottom there. The Iowa Manure Management Action Group web page on the agronomy website here at Iowa State is a great reference for all your manure needs. Or if you want to talk a little bit more of about the science of manure, please do check out my blog. But if you have questions, comments, or concerns, or want to discuss this or different issues further, please don't hesitate to contact me. With that, thank you, and safe hauling.